Okay, hi everybody. My name is Matt Taverna. I'd like to welcome you all to the Observatory on Social Media's Awesome Speakers event. Before we get started, I'd just like to talk about the Observatory really quickly, sort of introduce those of you who maybe haven't come across us before. So the Observatory on Social Media, which is the acronym AWESOME is pronounced awesome, is a joint project of the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering and the Media School at Indiana University. OSoMe is an interdisciplinary research group that is interested in all things at the intersection of media and technology, with a particular focus on social media, as the name implies. We conduct rigorous academic research, build analytical tools and software for both scientists and journalists, and work to educate the next generation of computationally skilled media professionals. We encourage you to check out the website. The link is at the bottom of the slide there, hopefully easy enough to remember. And there you can find sort of our latest research papers, tools, or really anything else that we've got going on. And as part of the Observatory's interdisciplinary mission, we've organized the Awesome Speakers virtual event. The event consists of a series of talks with some of the brightest researchers and scholars who are working to rigorously understand how social media, the internet, and technology impact the world. So please make sure that you check out the event page on our website. The URL is also there at the bottom of the slide. And there you can find more information on past and future talks. And if you find the topic of this talk interesting, I'm sure you'll be interested in some of the ones we've got lined up for you in the future. And with that, it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deen Freelon. Deen is the presidential professor at the Annenberg School of Communication and a leading expert in digital politics and computational social science. He was also a founding member and remains senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Deen's work stands out for both its focus on identity and power, paying particular attention to race, gender, and ideology, and his contributions to the research community through multiple open source software and tools. His research has been published in top journals such as Nature, Science, and PNAS, and has been featured in press outlets that we all know of, like Washington Post, NPR, The Atlantic, and many more. Dean's going to be discussing a topic that I think is really important for everybody and really highly relevant to the sort of current time. So I'm excited to pass things off, but as I usually do, I'll just sort of remind everybody of the typical structure. So the presentation will last about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we're going to kind of open things up for about a 15-minute discussion. So please save your questions for then, so we can have a nice discussion. And if you would like, you can sort of drop some things in the chat, and we can sort of bring them up at the end. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and Deen, I'll let you take over now. And I'm also going to share a link to a paper that Deen is going to be referencing throughout the talk. So you guys, please, if you're interested, make sure to check that out. I'll drop it now, and then maybe a little bit later when some other folks start to join us.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thanks everyone for coming in to join for today's talk. I'm going to share the screen so you can see what I'm talking about. I have some slides that I've prepared, and so hopefully everyone will be able to see that. And let me see. When I do this, I like to hide all my panels and such, because if I don't do that, they're just going to pop up in my face. Okay, so let me just, so that should be filling your screen now. So this talk is called The Post-API Age, Past, Present, and Future. This talk is something of an update of a paper that I wrote in 2018, which was the paper that was just dropped into the chat, called Computational Research in the Post-API Age. It was published in the Journal of Political Communication in 2018. It's received a little bit of attention, and interestingly, in addition to the citations that it's gotten, it has also been, I've also seen it referenced without citation, which in a way is almost kind of better, because, it's kind of like when people call tissues that you wipe your face with Kleenex, it has become a generic term to refer to a particular period of time after some sort of imagined golden age of data access. And so I really do take that to heart. I know that people love citations, but the non-citation use of that is very close to my heart there. And so this the talk that I'm going to give today represents a first attempt at me trying to collect my thoughts toward an update of this piece. Late last year, I was asked by a team that is editing a special issue, well, they're all special issues, of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science that has to do with data access and some other issues. And I pitched this to them, and they really liked it. So I'll be writing this up. The due date is in a couple of months. And so this is a really nice time for me to talk about this. I'm really interested in your feedback. You'll see that my thoughts are not 100% all the way baked, but I think that's actually good because you'll be able to point out anything that's inaccurate, anything that could use a little bit more thought, and anything that's missing. And so I'm really, really happy to be able to present this to you at this particular time when your contributions and questions will be able to be incorporated into the paper that hopefully will hit the academic streets by the end of this calendar year. So what is the post-API age? If you've seen me talk about this before, you may have seen this little visualization that I've created. I really like it, so I kind of try to use it as much as I can whenever I talk about the post-API age. The idea of the post-API age is one that is somewhat of I really like the way it's taken off, but it's somewhat of a misnomer because I think to some extent people expect that, oh, well, in the post-API age, there's no APIs. Well, actually, what it more so means is that we are entering an age of data precarity, but the data precarity age isn't quite as catchy as the post-API age, hence the name. So the other thing that I think is really interesting about this term and about this general historical frame is the fact that the age itself doesn't have a discrete like start and beginning and or the end of the previous age and the start of the new one. It's an overlapping time. And so in that sense, it's actually quite similar to the humanities concept of postmodernism, right? So you can't pinpoint an exact year when modernism ended and postmodernism started. It's overlapping. APIs are still very much with us, but we're in a state where we are, I think, a lot more aware of the precarity of the data access that exists with respect to various platforms. And that is ultimately what the post-API age is meant to symbolize. And my prediction at the time, when I first published the post-API piece in political communication, was that data access was going to become more precarious, more arduous and difficult to attain, and more limited. And I think in many ways that prediction has been borne out. And so in 2018, I sort of positioned ourselves in sort of an intermediate position that we would move more toward this in the future. And so as I advance slides, you can see now in 2025 that I would argue that we've moved further down the road along the trajectory that was started way back when I labeled this historical period back in 2018. So we've moved on, and we have begun to see some of the developments that were underway at that time evolve in some ways that were expected and in other ways that were not quite as expected. And those are some of the things that I'm going to talk about in my talk today. I've got really kind of three main segments of this. The first is sort of a concise history of social media data access. I'm really excited to talk about this. I think it'll be kind of fun. Those of you who have been doing this work for a while will get sort of a blast from the past. Those of you who have not will sort of get a sense of the way things used to be. And so for posterity, I think that historicizing what we've been going through and the way things used to be with respect to the way they are now is really, really important. So I've kind of parceled out different periods, sort of imposing my own historical view on this as somebody who lived through it and as somebody who was able to remember what it was in the moment, as well as take a retrospect view. And so I have a draft kind of series of periods that I talk about. And if you have suggestions for other ways to periodize this, I'm happy to discuss that as well. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about the present, where we are now. That's really, really important, obviously, for posterity, for future research that builds upon this work to be able to understand where we were in 2025 with respect to where we're going to be in the future. So I'll take some time to talk about that. And then finally, I'll wrap up in the third section by talking about the future. And rather than trying to predict, I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. I said, academics, at least, well, maybe it's just me, but I think that academics are just generally not really, really great at predicting the future because you have to have data, and data almost invariably represents the past. So, when journalists talk to me, they're like, oh, what's going to happen with this or that? I'm like, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball any more so than anyone else. But what I'm going to do, rather than trying to predict the future, I'm going to try to try my hand a little bit at shaping it. So the future section is not going to be about what I think is going to happen. It's going to be a set of normative principles for what I would like to happen. And I really would love it if anyone can add any contributions to this. A lot of this is based on my own personal experience. Some of it is based on established principles of data access. But any contributions or thoughts about that would be greatly appreciated, as well as any insights as to what's missing and unclear or inaccurate in anything that I happen to talk about today. So let's get to it. So just a little bit of terminological stuff. I use the term age to refer to longer intervals of time distinguished by particular characteristics, in particular the API and post-API ages, as demonstrated on a couple of slides ago. The term period refers to subdivisions within ages. This also, I want to say that this actually violates the rule. If you know anything about geological time, this is totally not in sync with that. So please don't, remind me of that. This is just the way that I talk about it. It's somewhat informal. And I was somewhat locked in by the fact that I used the term post-API age 7 years ago. But that is just the way that I happen to use these terms. And hopefully any geologically aware individuals out there will forgive me for my misuse of that particular terminology. Okay. So I want to talk about API prehistory, or the pre-API age. A lot of this was new to me. I didn't know a lot of this information. The first commercially available API was actually created by Salesforce, and it was introduced in February of 2000. This API precedes the introduction of REST. It was a SOAP API, I believe, and it pioneered the delivery of high-scale machine-readable data over HTTP. So this was a major milestone. The origins of the ideas of an API actually date back to the 60s, but this was the first commercially viable kind of proof of concept of APIs. The first RESTful API actually was introduced later that year in November by eBay, and was also the first API to make data available to external developers instead of only customers the way that Salesforce had. And so this was another milestone. REST was actually introduced in a doctoral computer science dissertation in 2000, and so now it's pretty much the standard for APIs if anybody knows anything about the technical aspects of it. But it was implemented very quickly, being introduced and published in a dissertation from 2000 and implemented by eBay the same year that the dissertation became public. In 2002, Amazon introduced an API that was famously implemented by fiat from Jeff Bezos, who basically said that Amazon is all about APIs. We're not using any other ways to do that, and anyone who doesn't do this is going to be fired. Have a nice day. Is pretty much what he said. And so Amazon's APIs laid the groundwork for the AWS empire, which is a really important backbone for the provision of data services across the Anglophone web. And so they were one of the early innovators in this space. In 2003, Delicious may have been the first company to make its API completely public. And so, among other things, this allowed users to freely share their bookmarks. For those of you who remember what Delicious was, this was a bookmarking service that you could use to save your various web pages and things like that. But the API actually allowed you to share this content with anybody else. It was totally free, totally open, and that was a first, I believe. I wasn't able to find any precedents for that. The last two are some that early social media researchers will remember. Facebook introduces the first version of its API in August 2006. It was the first true social media API, and Facebook's existed in various forms for nearly 12 years between 2006 and 2018. And so that they sort of were an innovator in that space. Twitter followed literally the following month, and of course quickly formed the backbone for social media research in many fields because of how easy it was to access and the breadth of data that you could get through it. And I think many of us here will obviously have lots of experience with Twitter API. Okay, so the next period, I refer to this as the laissez-faire period, because this is a period in which data access has a minimum of restrictions. It's very easy to access relative to later periods. So that's why I call it the laissez-faire period. Low touch. Platforms slowly tighten up after this, but during this time, it's really kind of a free flow of information with these APIs, right? Some of the major events include Facebook opening its API for applications for people applying to use it in 2007. In 2008, the first computer science papers using the Facebook API were published. As far as Instagram goes, they launched their API within a few months of having debuted in 2010. It's a read-only API. And so that existed between 2011 and 2018. Reddit announced its official API just a few years after it debuts. TikTok doesn't exist yet. Twitter has its API, the V1 of its API that's available between 2006 and 2011. Unlike Facebook, during this time, Twitter's API requires no authentication. And of course, in 2007, the first Twitter studies appear, predating, as far as I can tell, the first Facebook studies that used the API, although there were other Facebook studies that were based on surveys and other methods. The first Twitter studies using its API predate the first Facebook studies using its API. And then, of course, YouTube, the stalwart video service, launches its first API in 2007. Interesting thing about YouTube is that of all of these 6 services, it has been by far the most consistent in its data offerings, changing very, very little from 2007 to today. So for almost 20 years, YouTube has been quite consistent in its provision of the ability to manipulate its data, including downloading the content through an API. And so in some sense, YouTube is a bit of an exception to some of the turmoil that some of these other platforms have seen with its data provision regimes. So the next period I call the authentication period. This ranges from 2011 to 2018, roughly. I mark sort of the beginning of this period, dates, I would say, to March 2011, when Twitter moved from version 1 to 1.1 of its API, instituting a number of changes, the most significant of which was requiring authentication. I specifically remember where I was when this happened. It happened during the Arab Spring, and I was collecting data for it. And I was also working on my dissertation at the time. And so that was a major, major shift. Because before that, you used to be able, there was a service, people remember this, there was a service called Twapper Keeper that allowed you to create public archives of search and hashtag data. But the change to the Twitter's API at that time basically made Twapper Keeper and other such services obsolete. They were not able to operate with the new version of the API. A number of sort of increasingly restrictive actions occurred during this time, of which the transition from Twitter's API version 1 to 1.1 was only one. Facebook, only old school people are going to know about this. Facebook used to have a search API that was shut down in 2015. But with this API, you used to be able to, it was very similar to Twitter's former search API. You used to be able to pull any kind of public content through this, but they shut that down, supposedly for privacy reasons. And between 2015 and 18, only the Pages and Groups API existed. And in 2016, Instagram's API offerings were substantially curtailed. In particular, the amount of data you could pull down really went down a lot during that time. And the API itself shut down completely in 2018, along with Facebook's in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. As far as Reddit goes, push shift, those of you who've done any research on Reddit probably know about push shift. That was introduced in 2015 as a competitor, a more research-friendly competitor to Reddit's official API. Push shift had larger data capacity. You could get more data at a time. The limits were more generous. And so that was something that existed between 2015 and 2023. In 2014, TikTok's predecessor, Musical.ly, debuted. Of course, between 2014 and 2023, there is no official authorized option for collecting Musical.ly or TikTok data, but it comes into existence at that time. And then for YouTube, in 2014, YouTube implements the current version of its API, which means that for over 11 years, or 11 years this year, we've had basically essentially the same API regime for YouTube. So as I mentioned before, it's been by far the most consistent in terms of its data offerings of the 6 platforms that I discussed. All right, the limited options period from 2018 to 2021. So probably the most famous event during this time, and what marks the beginning of this period and the end of the previous one, is the shutdown of the Pages and Groups API for Facebook and the complete elimination of Instagram's API in April 2018. And so this is an event that I think really we can't overemphasize the importance of this event for data access enough, because between 2018 and 2020, there was no authorized access to Facebook or Instagram data, right? So this period begins in April 2018 and it ends in the summer 2020 when CrowdTangle is opened for academic applications. I don't think there's anything major about Reddit's data access at this time. If anybody knows any different, please let me know. In 2018, Musical.ly merges with ByteDance TikTok, creating the TikTok we all know and love. But of course, it's still 5 years before there are any official data offerings from TikTok. And that happens, of course, in February 2023. During this time, Twitter is in conversation with academics. I was on the Twitter Academic Advisory Board at this time. They wanted to talk to us about ways in which Twitter could make academic access to its data better. And so we had a wish list of things. They eventually implemented this in the Twitter Academic API, which marks the beginning of the next segment. And I don't think there's anything major development-wise for YouTube, but if you have any suggestions for what that might be, please do let me know. Then we have the academic cooperation period. This is kind of like a mini second golden age. And so during this time, there were several platforms began to offer data access options that were specifically designed for or easily accessible by academics, including CrowdTangle, which, as I mentioned, was introduced for academic application during the summer of 2020. CrowdTangle existed between 2020 and 2024, roughly, throughout most of the Biden administration. CrowdTangle was also available for Instagram. It replicated much of the functionality of the old Pages and Groups API with some limitations, some differences. Again, no major shifts for Reddit except for at the end of this period, which we'll talk about on the next slide. TikTok, of course, introduces its academic API in 2023. Twitter introduces its at the very beginning of 2021. And again, not a lot of huge developments for YouTube on this one. So this brings us roughly to the present day. And so this is, I have a couple of tables here where I'm going to talk about some of the things that have been occurring. This one just sort of summarizes some of the differences between the platforms along a number of different characteristics. So the first one is data access type. As you can see, APIs are very much alive and well, although they operate very differently from some of the ones that we were used to in previous eras. Facebook and Instagram, the meta platforms, have shifted away from the traditional API model, although they still say they provide APIs. Instead, they have moved toward what they call a clean room or cloud platform, which provides data through a web interface and does not allow you to actually download the data. In other words, you can't metaphorically touch it in the way that you could and export data from the previously available APIs and CrowdTangle. And so that's something that people have had some issues with, and something that is an ongoing matter of contention among people who study meta platforms. Reddit, TikTok, X, and YouTube also have their provide data through APIs through which data can be downloaded. Interestingly enough, all of these platforms except for X offer their data for free. This is something that is a holdover from the earlier eras of data access. X, surprisingly, has moved to, well, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, has moved toward a fee-for-service model. Although, I just found this out this morning, X actually has changed its free API tier to allow the collection of 100 posts per month. Now, those of you who remember, originally X's free tier didn't allow any read access, it was only write access. But now you can, in fact, get a generous allowance of 100 posts per month for free through the X API. Anything more than that, and you'll have to pay. These platforms have also differed a lot in terms of the requirement of an application. Facebook, Reddit, and TikTok all require this. They require details about what the research project is going to be, who's going to be on the project, blah, 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 lots of questions, sort of detailed applications here. X and YouTube do not. You can pretty much, and those of you who remember the way things used to be, I know this was true both for Facebook and Twitter, used to be able to sign up for an API key pretty much automatically. You just typed in a few details and it would sort of programmatically give you a key. And so I don't think that's true for any service other than X and YouTube at this point. And then of course, X only gives you the API key because you're paying for it. So that's a little bit different from the other platforms as well. You can see some information about rate limits. I mean, a lot of this stuff, Q stands for queries. So a lot of times the queries are done per minute, sometimes they're done per day, sometimes they're done per week. And so not only are you limited in terms of the total amount of data that you can procure during any particular time frame, you're also limited in terms of the total number of queries that you can make within a shorter time frame, like a minute or an hour. So, and at least for X, you can actually pay to increase those limits, but those pay tiers get pretty pricey pretty fast. And then of course the last one is something of a more specific reiteration of the first column. Thinking about this in terms of direct data access. All of these, except for the meta platforms, do provide direct access to the data that you can download onto your system and enter into any sort of analytical tools that you want to be able to use. The clean room access regime limits the types of tools that you can use with respect to this. So you can use anything. You can generally use, I think, R and Python and perhaps some other programming languages, but outside of that, you're limited in terms of what you can use there. All right. So let me just talk briefly about some general historical trends that we move through here. What I'm seeing is a set of increasing obstacles to data access, some of which include decreasing availability of data. There are some exceptions to this. So the total amount of data that we've had access to has gone down. The amount of data that we can procure during any particular time period has gone down. The variety of methods that we have of creating sample frames has been limited. And so relative to what was available before, the options that we have are both more limited and there are increased application and authentication requirements. As I talked about earlier, you've got to jump through more hoops. I'm pretty sure that for most of the applications, it's required that a human actually reads those and evaluates them. Reddit in particular states that their approval time is 8 to 12 weeks. And so that's obviously, a long time to wait for your access, whereas you used to be able to get these kinds of credentials within, pretty much instantaneously. And so that human factor really does really sort of puts the brakes on how fast you can do this kind of work. There are increased data security and management requirements. And so one of the best examples of this comes from TikTok. And among their other data security requirements, they basically require you, and I actually don't know, anybody who's used a TikTok API, I actually haven't used it myself for reasons I'll talk about in a little bit. But in their API terms of service, they require users to sync the API, to sync the local data with what is available on the live data, on the live platform rather, once every 2 weeks, which is which is an interesting issue because people have to figure out how to do that. So it requires a particular degree of technical facility to do that. And then also, the system has to be programmed correctly to be able to do that. So, somebody's got to check ideally to make sure that whatever's continuously running software process you've implemented to do this is actually doing what it purports to do. In my opinion, this is sort of a very difficult and onerous requirement to impose on researchers. It also causes issues for the research process substantively, as I'll discuss in a little bit. but as a procedural matter, it's pretty hard to actually implement. See my cat's back there. There's also a shift from free to fee-based access. This is basically X only, although it mainly impacts X. But I did think it bears mentioning because of the prominence of Twitter data in the social media research space. It's also something that has indirectly impacted Reddit because push shift basically ran afoul of Reddit's terms of service, and also the extent to which push shift was using the Reddit API, I think was far too expensive for the guy who runs push shift to implement. And so now push shift is only available for Reddit moderators. And so it's not available to researchers anymore. And so this rush to capitalize and collect money from these APIs has resulted in both direct implications for people who sign up for the API directly in X's case, and indirect implications for people who use push shift in Reddit's case. Some more general historical trends. So there are arbitrary and incompatible policies about which metadata are publicly available to researchers. If you've ever done research that has linked multiple platforms together, you're well aware of this. Obviously, there's going to be some of this is inevitable because platforms have different affordances, and some affordances that don't exist on other platforms aren't going to have metadata that's associated with them. However, I think it's possible to do a little bit better on this score. I'll talk about some suggestions I have for that in the future. I give an example here of some kinds of data that could be made available but that weren't. So for a lot of video platforms, including TikTok and YouTube, you could see view counts. You still can. X introduced this in 2023. The data were sitting there. It could have been implemented before then, but it wasn't. And so the sense that that there should be something resembling a standard of data provision, given that the metadata are available and that they don't expose too much private information. Certainly, I don't think you could make that argument for view counts. I think is something that should be adopted across platforms and would benefit researchers immensely if this could be done. Some platforms, as I write here, have solicited advice about this from academics over the years, including myself. However, I can't find any evidence that this has ever changed metadata policy. Maybe it has. They probably consulted people whose opinions they take more seriously than mine. But if anybody has any evidence on this point, I would love to hear it and cite it in this paper. Let's see. So another major trend that has emerged over the past few years is instability in data access offering. And this has caused a number of issues that I'll get into in a little bit. But by my count, Facebook and Instagram have each had 4 separate authorized data access regimes, right? So the original API, the Pages and Groups API, that's all for Facebook, CrowdTangle, and the Meta Content Library. And then Instagram's options sort of mirror that. Reddit has had 2, which ran concurrently at the time, so push shift and official API. TikTok has only had 1, but it started in 2023. So part of the reason for that is because of its recency. Twitter has had 4, and YouTube, again, as an outlier, has basically had the same access regime since 2007. So with the exception of YouTube, there has been substantial churn in terms of how this data have been accessed, which has had major implications for the specific tools that academics have used to access them. And I'll have more to say about this in a little bit. So there are some challenges that result from this. Some of these include, these are sort of general things that we have to work around. Some of these include the fact that the data we're interested in are held by private companies and/or end users, as opposed to generated by researchers or collected by public authorities. And so there's really no way around the fact, in many cases, that we have to secure some degree of permission to be able to access this data. It's not always true, as I'll talk about, but in many cases it is. As the term post-API age is intended to convey, access to these data is always precarious. It's limited in scale, scope, and time. it may be and has been revoked at any time without warning. Access can be expensive, sometimes prohibitively so. This is most obvious in the case of Twitter, but any of these platforms could decide to start charging for data at any time. Finally, the scale and scope of available data sampling and collection options are not always useful for research purposes. So between these different platforms, you have different options for obtaining data. Some of them allow you to do full text searching. Some of them allow you to search only particular fields. In some cases, it's difficult to collect data from specific users or from users that match particular criteria within their biographical information or by their location. And so what this does is it really limits the kinds of research projects that can be done. As I understand it, as a technical matter, I don't think that these problems are insurmountable. But as far as what is offered to researchers, our options for bounding our study and collecting the data that we want to can be difficult. And actually, before I go on, I should say that probably the area in which this is most problematic is actually time, right? So those of you who remember the time before the introduction of the Twitter Academic API will know that it was very difficult, unless you had a fair amount of funding, to collect historical data. The introduction of the Academic API solved that problem, but now if you want access to Twitter or access historical data, you have to pay at a minimum $5,000 a month to be able to access that. That's from Twitter's official offerings. They also have some licensed data partners that may charge more reasonable rates, but I haven't looked into those too deeply. So now I want to sort of come to a conclusion by talking a little bit about what I personally would like to see in future data offerings from platforms, and this is informed both by my own reading of the literature as well as my own sort of status as an active researcher in this space. I don't have too many citations on here yet. Truth be told, I wrote this, rather recently. The full paper will have more details and will sort of situate these recommendations in the literature a bit more. And so this is kind of a first draft of this. And so what I've done here, this should say 6 stages. It says 5. There originally were 5, then I added a 6th one. So instead of 5, it should be 6. And so I'm looking at data access, data format, data management, use, costs, and sharing. If any aspect is missing from this, again, please let me know. We'll start with data access. So one of the most important things that I think should be implemented here is the fact that there should be a presumption in favor of data access, right? This is very different from the presumptions that many journals have. It's also different from the presumption that many funding agencies have, where there's a presumption against you have to convince people to be able to give you a publication slot or to give you the money that is on offer from funding organizations, right? But social media data are not a limited resource like money or journal space. You might be able to make the argument about the provision of the infrastructure to provide the data, but honestly, there aren't that many researchers out there, so I don't think that's really going to break the bank for most of these companies. And so, if possible, there should be a presumption in favor of data access. Data application forms should be brief, which will avoid burdening both the researcher and the evaluator. Don't ask for anything that is not especially important. Obviously, I think it's reasonable for the platform to know who is actually accessing this data, who is, the span of the data, the time span that's being asked for, and other very basic information, your institutional affiliations, that sort of thing. But I do think it's also really important, moving to the third bullet, that platforms shouldn't put themselves in the position of evaluating a research project's academic merit, because that's not really their job. It's not really anything that they should really put themselves in the position of doing. More than that, it introduces a bit of a moral hazard for anyone who submits research that could potentially embarrass the platform. And so I think it's hugely problematic to put platforms in that position. The Meta Content Library has solved this problem by outsourcing evaluation of applications to ICPSR and Michigan. That's not always going to be a workable solution, but certainly this is something that I think platforms should get out of the business of. And then, of course, finally, this was something I ran into repeatedly when I was buying data from Twitter years ago. Clear guidelines for successful applications must be posted, and rejections should be accompanied by individual explanations, right? And so this reduces excess work on the part of researchers who've been rejected and who wish to reapply. If they know why they've been rejected, they can save time. If it's against policy to release data on particular topics, as was the case for Twitter at one point, just having that information puts everybody in a better position to maximize the quality of time spent in terms of trying to, on the researcher side, acquire data, and on the evaluator side, to evaluate applications that are of as high quality as possible. Data format. So data should be provided in a downloadable format to maximize research potential. This goes against the Meta Content Library's clean room environment. I understand the problem that's trying to solve, but it solves it at the expense of researcher flexibility. And I think there should be a shift more toward that. Obviously, I'm not exactly, I have a bit of a conflict of interest, but this is my presentation, so I'm going to tell you what I want. Data format should be non-proprietary. Most of the APIs that allow downloading do provide their data in JSON format. That should continue. It's in a format that can be accessed and manipulated by any computer system. Data fields should be standardized between platforms as much as possible. I mentioned this earlier. And I'm sort of proposing a new social media data semi-standard structure. It can't be totally standardized because, as I mentioned earlier, different platforms may have affordances that simply don't exist on other platforms, but to as great an extent as possible, this should be standardized. Another thing that's really, really important is there needs to be consensus on what exactly constitutes identifying information, and fields that may contain them should be labeled. This is really, really important to avoid privacy leaks. And when you're thinking about sharing data, as I'll talk about, obviously you don't want to be sharing any sort of privately identifiable information publicly. And so identifying fields that may contain this is really, really important to be able to scrub or omit that data when data is shared. Data management. Data set sampling details should be fixed at the time of acquisition, i.e. researchers should not be held responsible for continuously syncing local data sets to the live platform. This is an overly onerous requirement. In addition to the burden that it places on researchers, it also causes problems in the empirical and research process for things like replication, and also for the fact that the data set could potentially change as you're trying to analyze it, which is a huge problem. If you do some of your analyses and then you have to do other analyses, but between that time, your data set has changed, that can, depending on the degree of change, largely invalidate your research. So this is something that needs to be resolved, and my proposal is to fix the data set's sampling details at the time of data acquisition. I think that there could be some rare exceptional cases where requests could be made to delete specific data points for legal or privacy reasons. Ideally, those would be fairly rare. Other than that, they should just, when it comes out, that's what it is. Personal identifying information should be securely stored and deleted after a given time, 5 years maybe. Non-identifying information should be permanently stored in a data repository for replication and future research purposes, to whatever extent possible. In terms of data use, platforms should not attempt to prohibit any lawful and research-related uses of their data. A little known fact about Twitter's research terms of service is that it actually prohibited the political profiling or ideological scaling of Twitter users. Now, this is something that was widely done, in particular after Pablo Barbera introduced an algorithm to do this a few years back. But it officially goes against, actually it's maybe 10 years ago at this point, but officially that actually goes against Twitter's terms of service. But again, I don't think that the platform should be in the habit of telling researchers what to do as long as it's an established research purpose. One thing that would not count as an established research purpose would be, for example, using the data for business or for-profit purposes. those types of uses are already forbidden by research agreements. And so I don't think that'll be a really big change, but telling researchers what they can and can't do, I think, is really problematic. That's what sort of ethical principles are for. And that I don't think is something we should look to platforms to provide. Data costs. Well, platforms, I think, may charge reasonable rates for data that are clearly linked to the amount of data and system resources needed to retrieve it. A lot of platforms provide their data for free, which is obviously great. I also propose a sliding scale for researchers based on job status. And so if you're somebody who's working on something for your dissertation, I think lower rates are justified for that, versus if you're a full professor like me, I've got a research budget, and so I can pay a little bit more for mine. And so that's a suggestion to allow folks to get access to the data and peg that to ability to pay and to job status. Finally, we come to data sharing. So non-identifying information should be stored permanently in a data repository, as I mentioned earlier. Such data should also be explicitly allowed to be shared between institutions with other resources, researchers, and used in courses, right? So this was one of the terms of service changes that was introduced, the shift from Twitter v1 to 1.1, which prohibited data sharing. Obviously, it occurred behind the scenes, but it prevented data from being shared publicly. I think that non-identifying data should be allowed to be shared explicitly. Identifying information obviously is going to need some more protection, and so I understand that there would be more stringent rules that might apply to that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about unofficial data collection methods, and so I've engaged in the creation of some of these. Examples of these include scraping hidden APIs, intercepting XHR requests. There are many advantages to these. They may surpass data collection limits of official data options. Twint is a great example of this. It was the only free way to collect historical Twitter data between 2018 and 2021. They also may allow researchers to study phenomena that threaten the platform's image. And they may be the only way to study platforms that don't offer official options, as was the case for TikTok prior to 2023. There are a number of disadvantages here, including that they may not offer as many metadata fields as official options, as was the case for Twint compared to the Twitter Academic API. It requires a high degrees of coding skill and motivation to create these tools, particularly for non-computer science researchers. There are also limited development incentives for these researchers. If you're outside of computer science field, you're not exactly going to get tenure based on that, and it's not looked on as favorably as publishing in traditional journals and publishing books and that sort of thing. But of course, the biggest issue is the fact that such software can be disabled without warning by changes to a platform's code. This has already happened to me multiple times, so it's not really something that I can recommend, certainly to anybody who is, pre-tenure. I do it because I can't really stop, but that's a personal issue. Caveat emptor, as they say. Some of you may remember some of these systems that have been created, most of which are obsolete at this point, some of which have been developed by yours truly. But there have been countless hours that have been sunk into development of these systems, only to be invalidated by corporate fiat. And that's just how it is. You take on this responsibility, you take on this job with the knowledge that this may happen. This has already happened multiple times to my TikTok scraper, TikTok, which was introduced in 2022, which was an unauthorized, it was not authorized, it was unofficial system for collecting TikTok data, which still works today. So it's not on this graveyard list yet, but it could be at any moment. We're watching that. We were expecting that to happen with the TikTok ban, but since that didn't happen, it's still going. But who knows how long that's going to last. General question, what am I missing? What are other aspects of data work do you think could be improved, and how? Other things I can incorporate into this, I would love to hear about it. I know I'm coming up, I'm a little over time, so I'm going to move quickly through my concluding thoughts, right? Again, the post-API frame is intended to signal not the end of APIs per se, but rather the end of certain assumptions regarding long-term data availability, right? Those of us who lived through the laissez-faire and authentication ages unconsciously developed these assumptions, or I don't know, maybe it was just me. That were slowly upended by corporate prerogatives, right? This process was much clearer in retrospect than it was in the moment, in part because it happened so slowly. And so part of what I want to do with this paper is to bring a little bit more clarity to that so that we can help understand and steer the future to whatever extent is possible. ultimately, the future of social media access is mostly up to the platforms and not us. That's just how it is. But to the extent that they're willing to listen, we'll see. It may be possible to come to a compromise that balances the interests of researchers, platforms, and the public. And I hope this paper makes a contribution to that end. And speaking of ends, this presentation is finally done. And thank you for your attention. And I'm very much interested and looking forward to hearing what your questions and comments are.
Wow, thank you so much, Dean. That was really interesting. And yeah, you covered a lot. So thanks for making time, and we'll definitely have a little bit of time for questions. So I'll open things up to the group in a second, but I just wanted to kind of kick things off because I think obviously you're not gonna be able to sort of touch on everything, but I think one of the things that I was kind of interested in hearing your perspective on was like where does legislation play into this picture, right? Because all of these things are sort of nice and in theory that these systems that put sort of data access at play, but we're really kind of at the will of the platforms at the moment, for the most part, at least in the United States. And so I'm just curious if that's something that maybe you dig more into, or you're planning to dig into more in the paper, or if they are
Yeah, I
staying
mean,
away from it for a particular reason, or yeah.
yeah, I'll probably give a nod at least to the GDPR in Europe. But I think part of why I don't want to emphasize that too much in this paper is because the prospects for legislation in the United States at this time are not great.
Yeah.
It certainly isn't something it certainly isn't something that the Trump administration has any interest in. And so
Right.
to a certain extent, at least for the immediate future, such conversations seem overly theoretical for
Yeah.
this piece. I think one of the things that I might discuss is, at least briefly, the role that legislation or policy or regulation could play in standardizing requirements across platforms. But of course, I will mention what I just said, which is that that's going to require some political will that doesn't seem.
Got it. Cool. Thank you. I see some questions here in the chat. Let's see. I would love to hear your thoughts about digital data access through EU's Digital Services Act. Is this a workable solution on the side of researchers to access data? So I guess that's a little bit more about like the practicality of what already exists as opposed to future things that might work here.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll have to take a look at that. So I'll be honest, that's something that I've paid less attention to because I don't live in Europe, and so it doesn't apply to me.
Hmm.
I think that for the purposes of the paper, I think it would be worth mentioning. One of the points that I think that brings up is the fact that the policy options don't necessarily transfer across national or supranational contexts. The sort of will that exists in the European Union, I think, in the political climate there are quite different than what exists here in the United States, which is different from South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia. And so I do think it would be helpful to bring in briefly again some options. But again, as far as what those would have to be, I'd have to look at them a little bit closer than I have right now.
Great. Pranav asked, why do you think the YouTube's API has remained the same and not undergone the same turmoil as others? Is it just that much fewer folks work with video data than text data? And if more researchers started using the YouTube API and publishing with it, YouTube, Google might take a similar route as Facebook and Twitter.
That's a really good question. I'm actually currently working on a paper with colleagues to actually quantify the extent to which the different social media platforms have been studied over the past little over about 20 years. And so we'll be able to say, here is the total number, well, not the total, but in the sample that we're looking at, here is the proportion that is devoted to YouTube. Now, I do think one really interesting thing about the study of video and audio is that over the past few years, we've just started to come into a space where the computational tools have become good enough to be able to process that data at scale. So a good example of this is really, really highly accurate speech-to-text algorithms like Whisper that can basically take a video and spit out a fair amount of highly accurate speech transcriptions. And so that's something that may very well inspire more research on video platforms like YouTube and TikTok. And they may very well change their policies for that. I mean, one of the things, the differences between YouTube, owned by Google, and the other ones, I think shows is some of the differences in corporate culture and decision making, right? So think about when Cambridge Analytica happened, right? That was a Meta, Facebook, Instagram deal. Google didn't suffer from that, right? And so they had no reason to change their protocols in response to that, because they didn't apply to them. So I think it may very well relate to the relatively lower popularity of this of YouTube relative to some of the other social media platforms. But the study that we're working on, which is different from the paper I'm talking about here, will allow us to quantify those numbers. Yes.
Cool. Thank you, Phil. I'll pass things off to you.
Thank you, Dean. Great talk as always. So at the end, you talked about these alternative approaches like scraping and so on. So I wonder if you're willing to, considering that this talk is being recorded, if you're willing to share your thoughts about the trade-offs between, on one hand, the obligations that we have as researchers to make sure that our work is reproducible, which of course for much of our work in computational social science requires that other people can access the data that we analyze, which is now hindered by the changes that you described in platform API access rules. On the other hand, of course, we have obligations to comply with terms of service like everybody else, and contracts when and agreements when those are required for us to gain access to APIs, and so on. So these are two competing demands on us as researchers, one more on the legal side, the other one more on the ethical side. So how do you struggle with these competing demands? Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do. So this was an issue that I addressed in the original post API piece. And so one of the points I make in it is that in many cases, and this was a great example of this is TikTok prior to 2023. So sometimes, so in other words, I think it's actually, I think the situation is a lot clearer when there are no other options, right? So when I developed TikTok in 2022, it wasn't the only game in town, but the only games in town were I don't want to say unauthorized, I want to say unofficial data, scraping tools, for lack of a better term. And so the argument was, well, there is no official method, and so this is what we're doing to be able to study this for any reason, because the alternative is nothing, essentially. Now, I think there are other questions that emerge when there are existing authorized or official options that are not sufficient, right? So you want to do a study, but the official option does not allow you to do that. And I think at that point, the argument needs to be made on the merits and on a case-by-case basis. And so a good example of this is some work that we're doing right now. So as I mentioned, I've developed a program to collect data from TikTok. My research team and I are currently using this to study certain aspects of TikTok that are not available through its official research API. And what we make the argument that what we're trying to study is incredibly important, and official channels are simply not sufficient to allow us to be able to study these kinds of things. So yeah, I think that when possible, you should follow terms of service. I'm certainly happy to go on record as saying that. But I do think there are circumstances in which it is justified to do that. And what I've said this in a number of talks, but if a platform doesn't want you to access their data, you're not going to access it, right? Just ask Laura Edelson at NYU. I don't think she's there anymore, but they'll cut your access right off, which sucks. But at least you're not getting served with a lawsuit, right? It's both cheaper and more effective to do that. And so that could happen to us, our research team, at any time. We're taking a big risk for doing that. And so I think anybody who engages in this work should be aware of the risks that are inherent to it. But as far as I've seen, the risks are primarily procedural and not legal. And in most cases, I don't really think I don't really think of them as ethical either. Because what we're accessing is not privileged information. It's not anything that's private. It's all content you get access through a browser. We're just accessing it a little bit faster. And so that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I do think there are some complications there and some factors that may play in when you're deciding to use or create tools of this nature.
Thank you. If I say, just as a quick appendix, I completely agree. The ethical issues I was thinking about are not towards the platform, but towards the research community that to which we have an ethical obligation to make our data reproducible. That's what I meant by ethics. So
Yeah,
I agree.
I mean,
I agree with you.
I think that, but what's interesting about that is that honestly, if you look at some of the restrictions that TikTok imposes upon users of its research API, they run into the same problem, which is they've got provisions in there that cut directly against the reproducibility of any research that's based on it. So, so in other words, that is not a problem that is specific to the scraping and the unofficial options that we've discussed.
Thank you.
Wait, maybe we can squeeze one more. Doyle's been waiting for a little bit here.
Just real briefly,
then,
great talk. This is all great material. I just want to give a quick shout out and idea. It might be late in your timeline for this project, but to consider Blue Sky as another source, just because it's a rich and growing source. It has a lot of potential. I think it'll be obvious as this year goes on, but it's there, but it's also addresses some of the issues in access and other things you're talking about. So, I mean,
does it have an API? I actually don't know the answer to this question. Does it have an API or?
Yes.
It has everything. It has a rich ecosystem of developers have been thought of. It's so many things. I hope that they see this talk of yours and they respond to it and give you something to chew on. But it's
great. Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm on Blue. I have a Blue Sky account. I've not taken a look at its data offerings yet, but certainly I'll take what you've said under advisement if it's got if it has implemented some policies that could serve as best practices. I think that could absolutely merit a mention in the sort of third section of this paper. Yes.
Yeah, it is completely open. We are collecting the full fire hose. I completely agree with Doyle. Great. It is a very good resource. The only issue is that it doesn't quite have the same critical mass as some other platforms do yet, but it is growing. Hopefully it'll continue to grow. So I agree that that's one little piece of silver lining in the sky right now.
Sure. No, great. I mean, but even as a policy matter, I think it would be good to sort of point to them and say, well, this is something that's really great that Blue Sky is doing. The big boys should follow suit. Yeah.
And Mastodon as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, let's all thank Dean one more time. And thanks again for a great talk and staying a few minutes over here. And yeah, hopefully we get to see some of you for our next talk. So thank you so much, Dean.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.